Now that we've finished our main project, I would like to leave you with some food for thought on the subject of your pipeline. So I've borrowed a model from Anthony Ward's course on Pluralsight, modeling a cowgirl with Maya and Silo, and imagined that this character would be used in an advertising campaign. The client brief begins with a cowgirl stands in the desert, sweating in the midday sun. Obviously she's hot and she's thirsty, she wants a beer, so it's a beer commercial. She might have tattoos. The client hasn't decided yet if she has tattoos, and the client certainly hasn't decided what those tattoos might be. The same character is going to be used for print, TVCs and online, so we need to think about how we can distribute our vendors. And with any character work, it's important to think which features will most likely want tweaking in comp. In other words, which ones are most likely to need some kind of revision. In the case of our vignette, it was obviously the whiskey bottle and the gun. These are the primary targets. With a character, you almost certainly want to look at the skin, the eyes and the hair. So with that said, let's move into Maya and take a look. So here's the cowboy model. I haven't done very much to change the model. The only thing I have done, I made her waist a little bit less narrow because it was a bit disturbing how mangery it was. And I've added some dewdrops of sweat, which we can see if I open the outliner. So as we were saying, she's hot in the desert, she wants a beer, so I have created some sweat, and you can see these beads of sweat, and obviously I would want to carry on with this work and place them all over. Probably rather than doing it manually, you might want to do it using particles or some other system. Now these are some of the test renders we've got. Now in the close-up you see her eyes, these sort of big mangery style eyes. And you can also quite clearly see the sweat beads and how they work. So they work very well when they catch the light in the right way. Sometimes they don't work quite as well in some of the shadows. And in this shot, for example, you can see that some of them just look like dark spots. So this is why a compositing solution might be quite a good way to make sure that we get the ones that we want and don't get these effects like this one on the shoulder where we don't like the look so much. So I'd like to give you a quick example of my approach to this brief. Now this is not intended to be the only way to do it, just an example. So what I've done is I've created a camera for each camera angle. So I have a close-up, and we can view through the close-up camera, a wide shot, and an above shot. And then I've created render layers. So I have my beauty layer. Now the master layer I've switched off, and the reason I've used the beauty layer is so I can actually have a layer override on this as well. And now in the beauty layer, so in the master layer we had obviously the sweat bead geometry. In the beauty layer I have hidden those so they're not viewable, and I've created a few render elements. So I've just used the basic back to beauty, the lighting, GI, reflection, refraction, SSS. I've got my self-illumination for the eyes. As you remember, I was cheating the colour of the eyes using self-illumination. Specular, I've created a multi-matte element, which is just the lips, the skin and the hair. I have a cryptomatte, a denoiser, which obviously gives me my world pass, and it also will give me world normals. I have a diffuse pass, and I have a Z depth, so I can apply depth of field. I created an ambient occlusion layer using exactly the same method we saw in the earlier module, and with a very similar method I created this wet layer. What the wet layer does is just give you that extra bit of shininess. So the way I created that, very similar to the ambient occlusion layer, I selected the geometry and my lights at this time. Obviously I need lights for this, and I create new material override, and I created a black V-Ray material which is very, very shiny, and I will show you how these layers look like. So you can see in the profile, in the wide shot, and in our above shot. An element that is a little bit different is this shadow catcher. Obviously in our last scene everything was part of one scene and CG. In this scene we need to composite over a background. So what I've done with the shadow catcher, I have a floor plane. In all the other layers the primary visibility for the floor plane is switched off, and in this particular layer the visibility is on. In this layer, the primary visibility has a layer override, so the primary visibility is switched on. Now, primary visibility you find in the second tab along in the shape node. Now, leaving primary visibility on and everything else is on. With the Cowgirl herself, now I've switched off the these eyeballs. These are just shiny layers on top of the eyeballs, which you see in the close-up. But the Cowgirl herself, I've switched primary visibility off. But I have left on the visible in reflections, visible in fractions, and of course cast shadows. So she'll be casting shadows onto this flat bit of geometry. So when we render that, so you just get shadows on the ground which are correct for the perspective. Now it may be if there were some particular geometry that you needed, if you were on hills or dunes, you might actually have something that's not just a card and is a bit more curved, and then you'll get the correct shadows in 3 dimensions, which is one of the advantages of doing shadows in 3D like this. The last thing I did was created the sweat beads. So similar thing, in this layer the primary visibility for the Cowgirl is switched off, but she's visible in reflections and refractions, and the primary visibility for everything is off except for the beads themselves, and their primary visibility is switched off in the beauty layer. So again, we get this layer of just little beads of sweat, and we can plus those on in comp. So to finish off, I am going to give you a quick overview of my setup in Nuke.